it's not this kind of virgin wilderness that we're going to have. It's going to be definitely a human managed, robust ecosystems.
This is an interview with academic and homesteader Jason Snyder. He talks about the value of growing your own food, de-urbanization, the difference between homesteaders and preppers, and the uncertain future of the energy grid. You're Jason Snyder. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
I am currently in high country, North Carolina, and I have a background in applied economics, but now I'm teaching in like sustainability, agroecology. You never really know what to say about yourself.
What about your homesteading? So you're a
Yeah.
homesteader, right? Like,
hmm
what does that mean for you?
we what it means for me is that we bought a place with some land. We're on about 5 acres, and we're trying to basically each year, increase the amount of food that we produce for ourselves, and perhaps others that we give away as gifts. Right now, we're focused mainly on food, but maybe eventually, also energy, seeing how we can get more off grid, things like that.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay,
Mhm.
so I kind of assumed that you're just getting energy the same way as everybody else, and it's just about creating your own food. What kind of off-grid energy production are you taking part in?
Well, we're not right now. That's something that's so we're getting energy like everyone else right now. But I mean, part of the whole reasoning behind this, it has to do with a few reasons. One is in terms of food, I believe in like local food systems, regenerative food systems. I think that people in general should be producing, a lot more of their own food, if not individually, then at community levels. But energetically, I also don't like being dependent on, an energy grid, and energy supplies that I'm not, I don't really feel very reliant or I don't have much faith in the longer term. And so, so obviously then, getting more off grid, whether that's rooftop solar or whether that's just, producing heating through passive solar or firewood or whatever else we can
Okay.
do. But our focus right now really is on food.
So what can you tell me a bit about which foods you make for yourself and which foods you get from a grocery store?
Well, so we're in our second year, and so right now we have a garden, and so we get various greens and beans, potatoes, garlic. We're trying to produce a lot of that for ourselves. We have chickens, so we get all of our eggs for ourselves, and we have plenty left over, so we often give away a lot of eggs. Um, a lot of things, like things like pasta, things like meat, you know, milk, other items we get from the store or the food hub or something like that. Um, but yeah, the idea is, we're still kind of early in the process. So the idea is like, okay, like this year, can we, increase the amount of food that we can produce, that we can store, preserve, what are we gonna eat over the winter? And it's still a relatively low percentage, I would say, overall.
Yeah.
But, the goal is to increase that every year.
There's so much that's interesting there just about like
Mhm.
stored practices. Like for
Mhm.
millennia we had all these practices that we've lost within a couple generations for the most part, so
Yeah.
in some ways you're like keeping this alive, and so that's
Mhm.
like it seems healthy as like on a global or like societal scale where we've got all
Mhm.
these systems to feed us. That's a,
Mhm.
a form of almost redundancy, right? Like if something
Right.
bad happens then you still got that storehouse of knowledge, but like
Yeah.
on the local level for yourself,
Mhm.
it's not very economical, right? Like I assume you're spending more money for food, or am I
Mhm.
incorrect about that?
There's definitely initial investment costs, right? So, for example, this year I built a hoop house, had to buy materials for that. Built a chicken coop, had to buy, materials for that. Um, More expensive, I guess in terms of labor, if that's what you're considering, like the value of my labor. Yeah, if you included that at like my market wage, it would be pretty expensive. Um, but that's not how I really look at it.
Yeah,
One is I look at it as a quality of life thing, like, and also as a form of exercise. So
yeah.
I enjoy working outside. I enjoy using my body, and so in so many ways, it's a form of leisure. I would say. The idea over time, especially in kind of like permaculture type thinking, is that the amount of inputs decrease over time, right? And so the more we kind of get our system figured out, and we're also planting a lot of like perennials, like we're planting a lot of like fruit trees, nut trees, bushes, berry bushes, things like that. But the idea is over time, you get more for your inputs, both in terms of for sources of fertility, like bringing in wood chips, but also in terms of like your own labor.
Was this a sudden decision? Like, what led to the decision to do this?
I wouldn't say it was sudden. I mean, I think there's a lot of factors that were leading up to it. The fact that we found a place with some land was kind of a bit sudden, right? So we were looking for places, and I would have liked to get some land, but I wasn't, I wasn't sure if that was going to happen. At least, or at least nearly as much land as we got. Um, and this place just became available, and so that definitely opened up a lot of possibilities. Like, okay, now we have this land. That really kind of shifted me into homesteading kind of mentality. Whereas maybe I wouldn't have been in there before. But in terms of you know the larger kind of thinking ideas behind it, I think various factors led to that. Having to do with how I see the world, um, being very influenced by kind of bioregionalist or localist type thinkers and thinking. Um, so yeah, it's hard to answer that question whether it was a
Yeah.
sudden decision. I mean, once we got land, then I was like, okay, I can actually do something. So now, then I bought, books, permaculture books, gardening books, and it started. Once you actually like get physically involved with something, I think it tends to become much more, embodied, enacted, and so it
Yeah.
becomes a lot more real.
It's a very natural thing to try to do, to like have
Mm.
your own homestead and
Yeah.
grow a certain amount of your own stuff, but it seems like such a radical act given
Mm.
the nature of our lifestyles. But that's part of what I'm interested
Hmm.
here, is just like
Yeah.
we 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 we've only got a handful of ways to live that are seemingly natural to us in the modern environment. So it
Mm.
seems like a radical act to go and do this completely natural thing. But you
Yeah.
mentioned a little bit earlier about like you don't trust the energy grid, and I'm worried about like a solar flare. It's gonna happen. Like a solar flare is
Yeah.
gonna knock everything out, and we're not prepared. So
Yeah.
like to what extent? What's the difference between a prepper and a homesteader? Is there a difference, or is it just a matter of perspective?
Yeah. Well, first, let me comment on that. I mean, solar flare is definitely an issue. I also am worried about declining net energy and
Yeah,
thinking that renewables are not going to make up the gap. But yeah, difference between a prepper and a homesteader. Um, I would say that a prepper is storing stuff in their basement. They're storing, cans of beans and bullets and guns. It's kind of a dead thing, just sitting there. Whereas I'd say a homesteader is trying to produce a living system that will continue to provide, you know, not only for the homesteader in case of emergency, but also for the whole neighborhood, for the locality, right? So the idea is not complete self-sufficiency. That's not my goal, but being a producer in various ways, and you know having enough surplus in certain areas that I can give or barter with other people, neighbors, things like that, so that as a locality, as say a village, you can call it, we're more self-sufficient and we're more buffered when there are these major disruptions. And so I'd say a prepper is more individual, although not always. Sometimes people are preppers and they help out the whole neighborhood, right? If there's an emergency, but it's not about, it's about kind of storing up stocks. Whereas I would say a homesteader is about continually generating. I think the organic metaphor is pretty apt. right?
It would be impossible to be completely self-sufficient. That's ridiculous. We're
Hmm.
social animals. So
Yeah.
like the ideal situation is for a bunch of homesteaders to live in the same valley, right? Is that about
Y-
that's what you want? And
y-
then there's a bit of not too much redundancy. You're going to complement each other and do some trading probably.
Yeah, that's the idea. And where I live in the high country North Carolina and southern Appalachia more broadly, that is the history, right? At
Okay.
least at least for the well, I mean, you have a lot of history. You have the Cherokees lived here before the white settlers, but then even the settlers, you had basically what you're describing. You had a bunch of homesteaders who traded with each other and created these village economies. And so we're really far from that now. I wouldn't call all my neighbors homesteaders, although there is still kind of a culture of people. A lot of people around here have outdoor gardens. A lot of people still have farming knowledge. A lot of people have various types of practical knowledge, and so it seems like something like that could be booted up pretty quickly if our dependencies on a larger globalized system became more fraught. It seems like it could boot up pretty quickly, and that would be my hope if that were to happen.
Can you explain what bioregionalism is?
It's a couple of things. So one, it's a kind of a sensibility. So there's a whole kind of tradition of kind of thinkers, I would say, starting in the 60s and 70s. It's a sensibility of kind of generating an ecological consciousness or awareness, understanding Earth limits, trying to live within Earth limits, trying to rewild ourselves a little bit. It's a kind of critique on modernity, that we become kind of segmented off from different parts of ourselves, including our relationships with nature and how we relate to nature. Um, but and so it's rediscovering that, but it's also it's also an idea of scale. Um, this idea that oftentimes when you're thinking about ecological integrity, you have to understand it at, say, a watershed scale, right? Where something that happens upstream in the watershed will impact people, downstream. And a lot of our current kind of ownership structures and jurisdictional structures and stuff don't really reflect that, and it creates a lot of challenges in that way. And so a bioregion is kind of like a mid-scale. So like from a localist point of view, you have like a village, but then at a mid-scale, you have like a bioregion, and then planetary. It would just skip states altogether. Yeah, and so and bioregions are very fuzzy. Like the boundaries are very fuzzy, and so for example, I kind of consider Southern Appalachia to be kind of a bioregion because the idea is it doesn't just reflect ecological boundaries
Yeah.
or kind of coherent ecological entities, but it also reflects kind of cultural, culture as well, and culture and ecology, especially with the sensibility of you're trying to become more in touch with natural processes, natural flows are kind of hard to disentangle. And so, you can kind of go in a lot of different directions with this. Like a lot of people think we should be organizing our politics bioregionally, right? Like it's this idea that states, a lot of the state boundaries are very artificial. They don't really reflect ecological or cultural boundaries very well. And so, it's this idea that moving in a bioregional direction would be reorganizing, our whole politics in this way. But that's more kind of like the idealistic, or that's kind of more on the idealistic end. But I think at its core, it's a sensibility.
There's probably going to be more and more draw towards something like that, as like I hear
Mm-hmm.
a lot of complaints about modernity, and even though like
Mm-hmm.
we're clearly throwing in with the machine basically,
Mm-hmm.
there's also limits to how far we can push the rigid systems of complexity there. So what do you
Mm-hmm.
think would be required for bioregionalism and homesteading to catch on more? Would it take a catastrophe, or are there just going to be more people doing what you're doing? Or have there always been a radical fringe and you're just part of the constant radical fringe?
Mm-hmm.
But I keep hearing about it more. So I'm
Yeah.
assuming it's getting more popular, but I don't know what that means.
I mean, it's been around since the '70s, so there's definitely been, I wouldn't call it a radical fringe. I would call it a sane, you know, people who are sane.
Sure,
with
totally.
them
I
all.
wasn't I wasn't implying any pathology of
Right,
this.
right. No, I understand. I understand.
Yeah,
I think the pandemic definitely shifted the calculus a little bit.
okay.
A lot of people were stuck in like, apartment complexes in the city or whatever. And I think people felt very constrained. And so I think the pandemic, I've definitely, in my own anecdotal, observations on Twitter and elsewhere, I've seen an uptick. Um, in terms of whether I think it will take off, I mean, I would certainly hope so. I mean, I definitely think it's the direction we need to move to survive the future. Um, whether it will happen without like a catastrophe, I don't know. Um, I would hope that there would be shocks to the system that wouldn't be so large as to make a transition impossible,
Yeah.
but large enough that it will wake people up to to make the transition. Not to sound too theatrical or dire, but before it's too late.
Yeah, for sure. Okay.
Yeah.
How has it affected your relationships so far? Has it affected your relationships?
Not really. I mean, so it fits in. We moved here. We moved here because my wife got a tenure track position at Appalachia State. We're both, academics, and then I started teaching in this department as well. It's a department of sustainable development, and so a lot of the faculty here are kind of on the same page, to more or lesser degree, and but in terms of especially, sustainability, things like regenerative food systems, local food systems. Everyone's basically on the same page, and so we're kind of in a new place. This is not somewhere I've been all my life, and so the relationships that we've been developing here, are pretty concordant with that. And my wife grew up on a farm, on a little farm, kind of a hobby farm, and so this is kind of familiar to her. It's not too drastic for her. There's just a lot of learning. There's a lot to learn, right? Like you don't just go from being kind of a cerebral academic to a homesteader overnight, right? There's a lot of, learning how to work with your hands, how to grow food. There's a lot of trial and error. And I've definitely, still very much in that process. Other relationships, I mean, it's hard to say because we're just getting out of the pandemic. And so I haven't really seen much of my family in the last year and a half. My dad just visited. Um, but yeah, I mean, I guess it hasn't really affected our relationships one way or the other. Partly just because we've been cut off from relationships we had prior, or outside of this context.
So you haven't developed a whole bunch of homesteading relationships with other homesteaders, but that's kind of the ideal.
Not locally. I mean, there are a
Okay.
couple. So we have a couple people in our apartment who have kind of like little homesteads
Okay.
nearby, like within a mile or two of us. And so, like the first year, one of the guys was like bringing us various things to plant, and he was an agroecology professor, and so he's had a lot of stuff to share. And then our other friend who's also a professor, actually, they have chickens, they have land, they have gardens. They let us like harvest some of their willow branches to plant willow trees and bamboo branches and stuff like that. And so a little bit, but not nearly as much as I would like. Now, of course, there's Homestead Twitter, permaculture Twitter, and I'm definitely part of some of those networks. And so I've made a lot of connections with people across the country and to a lesser extent different countries of the world. Um,
Maybe that's how it has to go, is like
yeah,
everybody's a little bit isolated, but you've got
yeah,
the internet so you can share techniques. You could even maybe ship each other stuff as long as the
yeah. So no, for sure, for sure. So one example of that is one guy that I met over the internet, Vince Horn. He lives in Asheville, so not that close, but in the same region, about 2 hours away, right? And we visited each other's. We visited each other. We send each other like seeds, to plant. He sent me some squash seeds. I sent him some flower seeds, things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of this strange thing where a lot of us, we've talked about this, like, wouldn't it be great if we are all in the same place? Because then we can form these kind of density, kind of localist kind of interactions to actually form up kind of the villages, the eco villages, whatever that we want to see in the world. But we're all scattered. but on the other hand, I kind of see it as like, okay, like we're sharing information, we're sharing tips, camaraderie, all of this stuff, and I think that's good. And it's nice that the internet is allowing us to do that. But we're all going to have to like generate something where we are, right? And so we're all going to have to like form better relationships with our neighbors and create these kind of density of interactions with our localities, each on our own. But having these connections, especially long distance connections, helps us think that we're not like completely crazy or stuff like that. So that's nice.
Cool. It's important to note that you're not doing subsistence farming. You're not like relying on your farming to feed yourself primarily, even though that might be sort of the aim. You have a full time job or like a stable job.
Yeah,
You and your wife are both academics.
yeah.
So, is that kind of the ideal homesteader, you think? A person who has a nice stable income, but probably some freedom to be able to spend a good amount of time on this and the money to own land in the first place?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, in today's world, I think that's the only way to get started, right? It's
Yeah.
like you have to, yeah. I mean, buying property isn't cheap, especially these days. Being a full time subsistence homesteader, is almost impossible without some other gig in today's world, right? It's just that's just the reality of it.
But that's not necessarily a bad thing, though, right? It's like
Yeah,
there's no reason you can't have that role in society and also have some of these redundancies sort of built in as part of your
yeah.
system, a
No, it's not
connection to the
necessarily. It's
land.
not necessarily. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, in terms of like subsistence agriculture, like I would be happy if in 10 years we produced, maybe 50% of our own food. Like that would be a nice goal in 10 years.
For sure. Yeah.
And the remaining, say up to 45%, so all the way up to 95% total, would be like local from the local food system, and then maybe like 5% like spices and a few things that you just can't get locally. Maybe 5 or 10% would be traded longer distance. In terms of like the ideal of like having another gig, I mean, I think sort of. So, but it depends on. So for example, in the pandemic, a lot of people started working from home, started working remotely, and that definitely opens up opportunities to like, hey, I don't have to be tied to this location, say in the city. If I want to go homestead, I can work. I can get a place, somewhere else, and still have a stable income. I think that's a great bridge. I think in the longer term, the goal though is to start generating more of your income locally. So instead of like having a bunch of people who are, having remote gigs, eventually maybe they start up local businesses or something, right? And so, because I think definitely part of, to me, my idea of sustainability is localization. It's a critique of scale and creating circular economies at more local or bioregional levels. So yeah, but I think I really like this notion that used to be more bigger in the past of like a livelihood, right, or a vocation instead of a career, right? So a lot of people I think work, like I think this idea of working at like a job 40 hours a week, it's not really ideal. Like I would
No.
my ideal situation would be like working say 20 hours a week, generating an income, and the rest of my time would be on the homestead. Basically investing that income into the redundancies, into you know more self sufficient, a more self sufficient lifestyle.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Okay, it's interesting that you said about people maybe starting their own businesses with these things. I
Hmm.
wasn't going to go in this direction. I'm not sure, but like I'm reading right now Jane Jacobs' books, Cities and the Wealth of Nations, and
Hmm.
it's she mentions import replacing cities, and I get like this image like it's pretty easy for a city to stagnate. Like they
Hmm.
constantly have to innovate and
Hmm.
replace their imports with homemade stuff, but like it's all on such a mass production scale now. And you mentioned critiquing economies of scale, so
Hmm.
you like that basically means implementing inefficiencies, right? But like doing it again as sort of a radical act because it's worth it, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of ways I can go with this kind of question. I mean, I guess it depends on what the area that like what are we talking about specifically? Like for example, we're talking about agriculture. um, there's a lot of the critique of, say, agroecology, local food systems is that people say, oh well, it can't feed the world. It's not as efficient. You don't have these economies of scale. I think there's a lot of problems with that critique. One is that larger scale agriculture has a lot of externalities that it doesn't account for.
Yeah.
Um, One is highly subsidized. Large scale agribusiness is highly subsidized by the government. So it's hard to say, how efficient it is there. Two, it tends to destroy our ecological wealth, and in the long term will kill us.
Yeah.
Losing topsoil, losing biodiversity, losing our pollinators, producing harmful chemicals that impact our healthcare costs and many other things in other ways. Um, and so one is, I would just like to see if all of the costs were internalized, right? Environmental costs, health costs, cultural costs, right? What's the cultural value of small scale family farms versus these large, ugly, agribusiness, monocropping fields, right? Like, what's the cultural cost of that? It's very hard to measure. But in a theoretical world, if all of these costs were internalized, I think the calculus would be very different,
Yeah, I
right?
totally agree.
Mhm.
That's part of why I'm interested in this. That
Yeah.
like we're clearly going off a cliff, but
Hmm.
like we feel like we have such luxury and lifestyles as we're doing it that it seems like the best way to do it. And like when I keep calling it radical, I kind
Hmm.
of mean in a very short term for most of us.
Yeah.
Like I clearly what we're actually doing is pretty radical in that we're driving the whole thing off a cliff, and it seems like we're
Yeah.
probably doomed, and that this is like a potential answer, and it does require entire like region. Like we would need to on a large scale do this for it to make some kind of a difference. Okay, so to what extent does this oppose capitalism, and
Hmm.
to what extent does it actually make it more versatile instead?
This is also a complicated question. One thing about localism is that it's really a critique of scale, not so much of the exact economic system, right? So you can imagine, you have both kind of right-leaning traditional localists, and you have more kind of leftist localists, right? And it's this whole kind of world where you can imagine something like an eco village where there's a lot of kind of common property, right? So like, and very little privately owned property. But you can imagine something like that, or you can imagine something more of a hybrid where, say, you have, say, common pasture land. And this idea of the commons has been around for a long, long time before any notions of formal notions of capitalism or socialism or anything else. And where you have some things that are more privately owned, like I own some of my own stuff, my own toothbrush. I might have a small, a little business where I trade goods and services in the market. um, and so you can imagine a hybrid system where there's some elements of a market, market transactions, but there's also kind of a thick community life. You have informal, bartering and gift giving, and you have many other layers of interactions outside of the market that also have to do with productions of goods and services, right? As well as this notion of the commons, and or this notion of, for example, instead of all of us buying our own plow, if that's how we do our agriculture, we would have, or our own tools, we would have a tool library, something like that, right? And so when we're talking about capitalism, like, that's a very, like, people have very different definitions of capitalism, right? This notion of shareholder capitalism, where there's kind of an impetus to continue to grow and to earn value for shareholders. I don't really see room for that kind of capitalism. I just think it provides all of the wrong incentives in terms of kind of both resilience, because you're just trying to maximize profitability. Like, CEOs have a legal obligation to maximize shareholder profits.
Yeah.
That's a very narrow metric that you're trying to optimize at the expense of many, many other things. And so that kind of more modern type of capitalism, you know, I think it's definitely a critique on that. But in terms of like local markets, you know, mom and pop shop, you know, people trading, bartering, or selling with the local with some kind of currency, you know, goods and services, I definitely think there's room for that.
It seems like the natural progression is for things to get more automated and more rigidly controlled, and that
Mm-hmm.
this is a step back from that. But this is also like coming at a moment where we're acknowledging the unwieldy precariousness of it all, and like
Mm-hmm.
this maybe is even a natural progression to take a step back from the
Mm-hmm.
rigid control. Do you think this is a natural, like, so like, whereas previously I asked if it makes capitalism more resilient, maybe we should say,
Yeah.
does it make the machinery of society more resilient?
Um,
Or is it just for your own personal resilience? Is it only like pockets of
well,
it?
you know, so again, there's a lot of ways there's a lot of parts of this that I can pick at. You know, in terms of this kind of trend in society to become more like automated, you know, one could say more efficient. Um, you know, I think that has a lot to do with um, the fact that we discovered fossil fuels a couple hundred years ago. Of course, you know, humans are very clever. There's been a lot of, you know, ingenious inventions, things like that. But none of this would have been possible without the discovery and utilization of fossil fuels. It just wouldn't have. I mean, we went from, you know, you know, an energy return on investment of like 5 or 6 to like to 1 to like 100 to 1, and
Yeah.
so that just you know enabled you know incredible specializations, right? Incredible, you know, orders of magnitude more roles, types of jobs in society. Um, you know, layers or levels of hierarchy. You know, all of these different things, and you know, this energy bonanza that we've been experiencing, I don't think is going to be here in the long term. Um, you know, in terms of so I think that there is this kind of like, if you want to call it this natural growth, you know, if you want to say that we're running out of energy as a natural phenomenon, yeah, and so we're going to have to descale, degrow. You know, I do think there's going to be less. There's going to have to be less material throughput. We're going to have to figure out how to, you know, have less energy intensive lifestyles, and a lot of these technologies that were labor saving because of cheap energy are no longer going to be viable. And so we're going to have to bring back labor, you know, bring back working with your hands, bring back, you know, hopefully not, you know, hopefully in a different way in the past, right? Like we don't want to bring back slavery. We don't want to bring back, you know, a lot of the labor saving institutions of the past that we find, you know, pretty horrific. And then of course, you know, we haven't talked about climate change, but that's also an elephant in the room, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so I see it as kind of like, you know, no matter which way you look at it, we're going to have to figure out, you know, the idea of a global industrial system or global capitalism. I don't think is long for this world. Um, and so, what's next is the big question for me. And I think it will have to be some kind of what I would call cosmopolitan localism, where hopefully we can maintain a lot of the kind of cosmopolitan connectivity of globalism, but I think a lot of our production, actual production, is going to have to be more localized, and it's probably going to be less complex or less complicated.
So for like most of us live in cities,
Mm-hmm.
large scale homesteading is not an option.
Yeah,
Um, Probably we could grow our own herbs and mushrooms in our apartment. But
yeah,
like, should we, based on this, like if we were going to try to adopt this within our scope, should we
yeah.
just be buying local basically?
Um,
Does that make a
I mean,
difference, or
that's
is
a
it
good start. You know, I tend to think that we're going to have to de-urbanize as a
okay?
society, because cities have a huge land and resource footprint that, you know, it's definitely not a bioregional, like New York City is definitely not a bioregional city, right? It's not integrated into its bioregion. It draws upon goods and resources from all over the world. It requires on long distance transport. abundant, cheap energy, all of these things. And so I do think we are going to have to de-urbanize. That said, I do think there is definitely a role for towns, you could say small cities,
Okay.
but I think, it can go in different directions. You have some cities, say like that, say in the industrial Midwest that have like de-urbanized radically in the last few decades, right? Like Detroit, things like Detroit.
Yeah.
I mean, Detroit has a lot of land area, but it's fairly depopulated. And what you've seen in the last decade is like an urban agriculture movement, come on board, right? And
Oh,
so,
really?
yeah, so there's a lot of, it's growing, it's grown pretty quickly in the last 10 or 20 years. And so I can see kind of formerly very densely populated cities becoming depopulated, and then the people who are left, having more land to engage in urban agriculture. And I think in a more urban environment, it would be a more collectivist type thing where you'd have like community gardens, stuff like that. And then, people moving out into the countryside and utilizing, a lot of the land that was used for kind of industrial agriculture, being taken up by smallholders, right? Um, and again, the exact institutions, the exact ownership structures, I'm not sure about. I think there's a role for like more collectivist types, like somebody creates a community land trust, and then within that you have like permacultural cooperatives and things like that. But then also like people just buying or being allotted a couple acres, a few acres for their family, and working their own plot, things like that. In terms of like a city, I think in cities now, people can think about, if they have a little bit of land, like a little backyard or something, say in kind of a suburban or near a city, they can definitely think about growing a garden. Again, they could try and join or create a community garden, um, and they could buy more locally. I think that would definitely help. Um, but I guess in the longer term, I just think that de-urbanization is inevitable.
Last weekend I was debating this with some people. I
Mm,
was taking the homesteading side and they were all kind of against it. Their
yeah.
major argument was basically de-urbanization, which is that like urban sprawl, right? Like
Hmm.
if everybody has a homestead, then like the entire land is covered in houses, and like we're trying to build vertically now because we can fit more
Hmm.
people into a land space. That seems like a better, like a more efficient way to do things. But humans are great gardeners, and
Yeah.
for how many tens of thousands of years, or how many thousands of years, we were basically all living like that anyways. So do
Hmm.
you think it would actually be healthier if we all had a bit more, if we had more land each and a bit more control over that land and a better relationship with it? That would be healthier. Like that's your image.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the argument you're talking about. There's a segment of the environmentalist movement that says, okay, we all need to urbanize very densely, and then create, basically free up a lot of land for wilderness. And
Yeah.
I just think that's a product of a modernistic mind of
Okay.
segregating humans from the environment. I don't think that's how we're meant to live. I don't think we're going to be happy living like that. I think there's going to be even more mental health problems, moving in that direction. I think we need to be integrated with our environments. We need to rewild ourselves a little bit. And so I'm definitely, of, of the view that, you know, uh, people need to be connected to, at least to some degree, to some of the sources of their sustenance. And it needs to be very tangible to them, because if it's not tangible to us, I think that's part of the reason why we're having these environmental problems, is that it's also abstract now, right? Like we don't understand the idea of ecological limits, things like that. It's not we don't understand it in any kind of tangible sense. In terms of the practicalities, that's a whole different issue, because again, the population has grown tremendously in the 20th century, um, due to many things, but partially due to the net energy that was afforded to us by fossil fuels. And so figuring out, okay, these massive populations de-urbanizing, is that going to create problems with the landscape, or is that going to destroy wilderness? It could go in that direction, but I think that one reason why I'm so enamored with kind of a agroecological or permacultural way of thinking is like, well, we have to figure out how to provide for our own sustenance while also improving, while working with the larger ecology, working with it, in some cases improving it, but it's not, it's not this kind of virgin wilderness that we're going to have. It's going to be definitely a human managed, robust ecosystems, right? And so I think we need to get away from this kind of myth of the pristine wilderness. I mean, so there was a recent paper, I think it was in Nature, where it talked about the Amazon, and scientists are starting to are starting to the hypothesis is that it's actually, the Amazon is actually a well managed food forest, right? Like there's just a lot more food crops within the Amazon that are useful for humans than would be if humans hadn't been a part of it, right? And so that's an example of, humans figuring out, how to work within ecosystems to provide sustenance for humans, but also not to destroy, their the larger ecology. And so I think we need to move in that direction.
Yeah, I've thought for a long time, like, we're gardeners and we should
Mhm.
think of the earth as our garden rather than to separate it as some entity that we dare not touch and
Yeah,
should just leave alone.
yeah,
It's like we have the capacity to think ahead. We could almost be the best thing for nature if we were
yeah,
to try to live that way. And what you're talking about seems like the beginnings of a way to potentially on a large scale implement our role as gardeners. But
yeah.
like we've got this sickness of profiteering basically, which
Right.
it infects it like it spoils our own lives as well as the environment. So I just don't like,
Yeah.
how do we break out of that?
Yeah, I mean, take topsoil for example. Like you hear reports of like we're losing topsoil. Some people say in certain areas we have like 30 to 50 harvests left, and then it's all gone. Things like that, and it takes hundreds of years to build topsoil. Well, that's if it's left alone, but humans can actually build topsoil pretty quickly. With intentional, if with the right techniques and intention. You have many proof of concepts. Of people building up topsoil, within a few years, right? Following various permaculture, agroecological techniques. And so I definitely agree with you with this idea that, you know, we should be thinking of humans. I mean, we're participants, but also as stewards in nature, and we have the capacity to both destroy nature, but also to um, you know, also to improve it. I would say pretty quickly if that's if we're coordinated and that's where intention lies and we know what we're doing and there's we have the knowledge, we have the techniques. It's just a matter of the willpower.
Do you know how much do you know about the urban agriculture in Detroit? Can you tell me some like specific practices that people are doing that you know about that maybe somebody might be able to implement?
I mean, just like what I've seen in documentaries and stuff like that. I mean, I used to live in Michigan. I used to live, and so I knew people who were involved a little bit, things like that. I mean, so one issue in especially former like industrial, deindustrialized cities, is that you have to worry about soil being polluted, right? You have to worry about like heavy metals and so on and stuff like that. And so oftentimes, what people do in kind of a urban ag environment is they create these raised beds, right? And they start off by, usually they have to like import soil. So basically, they're actually not growing on the base soil. They're creating these beds of like new soil that then they're developing over time. Um, you know, from what I know, and I don't really know, to be honest, a lot of the details of the urban ag in Detroit, but if you Google it, you'll find a lot of information about it. But I know that there's a lot of like community groups that promote, that try and get youth involved to work in community gardens. You have various small farms. You have, I think there's kind of a bit of a foodie scene where they try and take in produce produced within the city to feed at restaurants, stuff like that. But yeah, I would recommend just googling that one.
One, I want to imagine a kind of secular high tech monastery where nerds read and do like tech work, but also tend to livestock and farming, like in Anathem, the Neil Stevenson book. So it's like the perfect mixture of connected modernity and
Mhm.
connection to the earth, an archetypal situation for gig workers. Does
Mm.
this exist anywhere that you're aware of? Have you heard of this implemented?
Hmm. Well, I mean, I know that there's some people trying to create something like that. So you might have heard of like, do you know about like the Future Thinkers podcast?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
okay, you're familiar with that. So I know that they're trying to create what's called a smart village
yeah.
in somewhere in BC, Canada. And their idea is basically to have something like that, where they have basically people who come, a lot of kind of technologist type people, doing, they have kind of their own types of remote work, but then they also contribute to like the agriculture, farming, and I know their idea, and they're just trying to get proof of concept for this first site. But I know that their idea is basically to, if it does work out and they can figure out all of the challenges, overcome all the challenges, then to replicate it and have it kind of as a prototype. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think just in the last couple of years, there's a lot of people thinking along these lines.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm
And
not intimately involved with any of them. I'm just on my own
yeah,
homestead.
yeah,
So yeah,
that's cool.
and I'm not much of a techie. So
How can I seek out and make friends with homesteaders now in case shit goes down?
um, well, there's homesteading Twitter or localist Twitter. I know that Joe Norman has like he has a Twitter list called like Localists and Homesteaders. Um, Ashley Colby and I have started this series on the Stoa. I don't know if you're familiar with the Stoa, Peter Lindbergh's platform, but called Doomer Optimism. And so we've been doing a series of kind of videos and presentations and interviews. It's ongoing. And Ashley Colby at Rhizoma School on Twitter, she has a list called Doomer Optimists, and they're all people who are kind of, basically are thinking along these similar lines, and a lot of them are homesteaders or wanting to be homesteaders. Um, yeah, I can send you links to a couple of these lists if you want to just
Yeah,
you
please.
know be know who's kind of like in the scene. But there's a lot, and not all of them get along with each other, right? Like there's like with anything where you have like kind of some kind of like scene or movement, you have things that people agree on. That's like an overarching like, yeah, people are interested in homesteading, but then you have a lot of disagreement, a lot of ideological differences along other axes and things like that. So it's not like this one big happy family, but I would say that there is definitely kind of like a mimetic tribe, loosely called, doomer optimists or localists or homesteaders or permaculturalists or bioregionalists, things like that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, the last question is I saw like a bit of a saga on your Twitter. You had these tadpoles that were drying up. So can you
Uh-huh.
tell us how that turned out or like tell us the story of the tadpoles?
Yeah, well, so this winter, I just decided to start digging a pond in my yard. There's a place on my property where water tends to accumulate and it tends to flood at certain parts of the year. And I saw on YouTube this guy was talking about these ponds that he had been digging, and I just got inspired, and I didn't, I was kind of like feeling the need to like get outside, get some physical exercise. And so one day I just started digging with a shovel, at this low point of the property. And for maybe an hour or two every day, I was digging with a shovel for most days, for maybe like a month or two. And I ended up with a pond, and I've pictures on Twitter of it. And over time, I saw that that frogs had found it and were laying eggs and started getting tadpoles. Now it's kind of a sad saga because it's been a very dry spring, and the pond dried up, and so a lot of the tadpoles died, but some of them became frogs before it dried up. And so now I've got, tons of like little baby frogs hopping around the property. Like they've gone pretty far. And so, and I believe that most of those frogs are from the pond. And I believe that because I saw some of those frogs, in the kind of the pond that before it, when it was almost dried up. And so I believe that some of the tadpoles made it out, and now they're frogs, and and they're right outside. So that's how it turned out. The pond is not very deep. It's only like a foot and a half deep, and so in the longer term, I would like it to get much deeper, so it doesn't dry out. I might end up bringing in an excavator to do that, or I might just continue to dig. We'll see. But eventually, I'd like to like raise fish and stuff like that.
Oh, cool.
But it
Okay.
would have to be much deeper to so it doesn't dry out.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's all I had. Thank you
All
very
right.
much. That's
Yeah.
been very informative. Where can people find you online? Or can people find you online? Do you mind if people get in touch with you?
Yeah. Well, I think Twitter is the best approach at Cognizor. I also, am on YouTube. There's a whole number of interviews like this on YouTube now. If you just type in my name in YouTube, you'll find, half a dozen or more of these. And so, if you want to actually reach out to me, yeah, my Twitter, my DMs are open. So
Cool.
that's the best way.
Okay. Well, thanks again.
Yeah.
Take care, Jason.
Thank you, Matthew.